A flight attendant slaps a black elderly passenger, frustrated and overwhelmed, until gasps ripple through the cabin. She's just struck the CEO of the very airline she works for. Her career is on the line, but instead of firing her, he gives her a shocking choice. Why would a billionaire disguise himself as a nobody? And what secret is he hiding? The truth will change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Elijah Bryant stood alone in the private lounge of O'Hare International Airport, studying his reflection in the full-length mirror. The man staring back at him looked nothing like the powerful CEO of Sky High Airlines. Gone was the perfectly tailored suit, replaced by a wrinkled button-up shirt that had seen better days. His normally polished appearance had been carefully dismantled. He adjusted the thick-rimmed glasses on his nose, the fake lenses slightly smudged. His usually well-groomed salt-and-pepper hair was purposefully messy, making him appear closer to 70 than his actual 55 years. The transformation was remarkable, but more importantly, it was believable. "Perfect," he murmured, running a hand through his disheveled hair one last time. The slight tremor he'd practiced adding to his hands completed the illusion of an elderly passenger. Elijah picked up the worn carry-on bag he'd purchased from a thrift store. The scratched leather and frayed handles were a far cry from his usual premium luggage. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, then deliberately hunched them again to maintain his disguise. As he walked through the bustling terminal toward Gate B-15, Elijah felt invisible, exactly what he wanted. Airport staff rushed past without a second glance. The cleaning crew barely looked up from their work. It was a stark contrast to his usual experience, where everyone seemed to know who he was and rushed to accommodate him. The boarding area was already crowded when he arrived. In first class, a gate agent was greeting passengers with warm smiles and cheerful banter. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Davidson. Your usual seat is ready for you." The agent's voice carried across the waiting area, bright and engaging. Elijah took a seat in the economy section, placing his bag carefully at his feet. He watched as the first-class passengers were treated like old friends, each interaction personal and unhurried. Then came the business class announcements, still professional but notably less warm. When it was time for economy boarding, the entire atmosphere shifted. The same gate agent's voice turned mechanical, rushing through zone numbers with barely concealed impatience. "Now boarding Zone 4, rows 20 through 25. Elijah joined the shuffling line of economy passengers. The young gate agent, Brittany, according to her name tag, looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she was nearing the end of a long shift. As passengers approached her podium, her gaze remained fixed on their boarding passes rather than their faces. "Sir?" Brittany's voice barely registered as she held out her hand for Elijah's boarding pass. Her eyes never left the computer screen as she scanned his ticket. "Thank you. Enjoy your flight." The words were automatic, empty of any real warmth. Elijah shuffled down the jet bridge, intentionally moving slower than his usual confident stride. The flight attendant at the aircraft door gave him a cursory nod, already looking past him to the line of passengers behind. Inside the plane, Elijah carefully made his way down the narrow aisle. Business travelers tapped impatiently on their phones, while parents struggled with restless children. A flight attendant rushed past him without a word, nearly catching his elbow with a drink carrier. His seat was near the back of the plane, 32C. Standing beside his row, Elijah lifted his carry-on bag toward the overhead bin with deliberately shaky hands. The bag wasn't heavy, but he made it appear so, letting out a small grunt of effort. Passengers streamed past him in the aisle. Some squeezed by without acknowledgement, while others shot annoyed glances at the delay he was causing. Not a single person offered to help. A flight attendant walked by, noticed his struggle, but continued toward the back of the plane without pausing. Finally, with another exaggerated effort, Elijah managed to push his bag into the bin. He lowered himself into his seat, adjusting his glasses, which had slipped down his nose during the effort. The middle seat next to him was still empty, but across the aisle a young mother was trying to settle into her seat while balancing a crying toddler on her hip. "Shh, baby, it's okay," she whispered, bouncing the child gently. "We'll be home soon." The businessman in the seat behind her let out an exaggerated sigh, shooting an irritated look at the back of her seat. The mother's face flushed with embarrassment as she tried to quiet her child. Elijah sat back, taking in every detail of the scene around him. The cramped seats, the harried flight attendants, the subtle tensions between passengers. It was all so different from the carefully curated reports that landed on his desk. This was the real experience of flying sky-high airlines, unfiltered and raw. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he was witnessing. The airline he'd built from the ground up, the one he'd promised would treat every passenger with dignity, had somehow lost its way. The disparity between the first-class experience and economy was more than just the width of the seats. It was in every interaction, every gesture, every moment of service or lack thereof. More passengers filed past as the plane continued to fill. The overhead bins slammed shut one after another, and the cabin grew warmer with each passing minute. Through it all, Elijah remained still and observant, his disguise allowing him to witness the true face of his airline through the eyes of an ordinary passenger. Claire Morgan stared at her reflection in the break room mirror, her fingers working mechanically to smooth her gray-streaked hair into a tight bun. Dark circles lurked under her eyes, carefully hidden beneath layers of concealer, but nothing could mask the bone-deep weariness in her movements. The crew lounge hummed with the usual pre-flight activity, younger flight attendants chatting excitedly about their layover plans, the coffee maker gurgling in the corner, rolling suitcases clicking against the tile floor. Claire ignored it all, focusing instead on the schedule change notification that had popped up on her phone an hour ago. Chicago to New York, she muttered, shaking her head. Of course they would. The route was notorious for demanding passengers and tight turnarounds. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pinned her name tag to her crisp navy blue uniform. Janet Williams pushed through the break room door, her own uniform pristine and her smile warm. "There you are." I heard about the schedule switch. "Did you know about this?" Claire asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "They're working us like pack mules, Janet. I was supposed to have the Denver route today. Nice and easy. Mostly business travelers who sleep the whole way." Janet set her bag down and poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the counter to Claire. "I know it's frustrating, but you're the best senior attendant we have. They trust you with the tough routes." Claire wrapped her hands around the warm cup but didn't drink. "Trust? More like they know I can't say no. Not with—" She trailed off, her throat tightening. "Tom's medical bills?" Janet asked softly. Claire nodded, her jaw clenching. 3 years since he's been gone and I'm still drowning in them. And now they're talking about mandatory retirement at 65? I can't afford to stop working, Janet. I just can't." The break room had emptied out, leaving them alone with their cooling coffee and hard truths. Claire's shoulders slumped as she leaned against the counter. "Remember when we actually enjoyed this job?" Janet asked, stirring creamer into her coffee. "You were the one who taught me how to handle difficult situations with grace. You always said every passenger was carrying their own invisible burdens." "That was before," Claire snapped. "Before entitled passengers started treating us like their personal servants. Before they started filming every interaction hoping to go viral. Before ... She gestured vaguely at everything and nothing. "Before Tom got sick," Janet finished gently. Claire's eyes burned. "I don't need a therapy session, Janet. I need to make it through another day of pampered princesses demanding warm nuts and businessmen who can't be bothered to look up from their phones when we're trying to keep them safe." Janet set her coffee down with a firm click. "Claire Morgan, I love you like a sister, but you're letting bitterness poison everything that used to make you great at this job." "Great?" Claire laughed harshly. "I'm surviving, Janet. That's all any of us are doing." The break room door swung open again and Jake Hernandez bounded in, his uniform perfectly pressed and his smile bright enough to power a small city. "Good morning, ladies. Ready for another amazing day in the friendly skies?" Claire and Janet exchanged looks. Janet's amused, Claire's exasperated. Jake was 29, still starry-eyed about flying, still believing every passenger was a potential friend. "Amazing isn't the word I'd use," Claire muttered. Jake's enthusiasm didn't dim. "Come on, Ms. Morgan, we've got that full flight to New York. I heard there's a school group heading to Broadway. Isn't that exciting? Claire's groan was audible. Teenagers. Perfect. They're drama students, Jake continued, either missing or choosing to ignore Claire's sarcasm. Maybe they'll sing for us. I need something stronger than coffee, Claire said, dumping her untouched cup in the sink. Janet checked her watch. Time to head to the gate. Claire, you ready? Claire straightened her jacket, smoothed invisible wrinkles from her skirt, and checked her hair one final time. Every movement was precise, professional, muscle memory from decades of service. But her eyes in the mirror looked tired, resigned. The three of them gathered their things and headed toward the terminal, Jake practically bouncing as he walked, Janet maintaining her usual calm presence, and Claire bringing up the rear with heavy steps. As they approached the gate area, Claire could already see the crowd forming. Business travelers tapping impatiently at their phones, families wrestling with overstuffed carry-ons, the teenage drama students gathering in excited clusters. Let's get this over with, Claire muttered under her breath, squaring her shoulders as they walked toward the plane that would carry them to New York. The afternoon sun filtered through the airplane windows, casting long shadows across the cramped cabin as passengers continued to board. Claire moved with practiced efficiency, her movements sharp and precise as she helped stow bags and directed people to their seats. Her professional smile felt more like a grimace with each passing minute. Excuse me, a woman in 14C waved her down. My screen isn't working. Claire's jaw tightened. Have you tried turning it off and on again, ma'am? Of course I have, the woman huffed. I paid good money for this flight. I expect everything to work properly. I'll make a note of it, Claire replied curtly, already moving past. She could feel a headache building behind her eyes. 2 rows ahead, a man in an expensive suit blocked the aisle, wrestling with his oversized carry-on. This bin is full, he announced, as if this were somehow Claire's personal failing. Sir, there's space 3 rows back, she said, pointing. When he didn't move, she added more firmly, You're blocking other passengers. The man shuffled backward, muttering something under his breath. Claire chose not to hear it. Miss, another voice called out, do you have any extra blankets? It's freezing in here. The temperature is standard, sir, Claire responded automatically, but I'll check for blankets once we're airborne. The cabin felt increasingly claustrophobic as more passengers squeezed their way down the narrow aisle. Claire's uniform collar felt too tight, her shoes already pinching after hours of standing. A baby started crying somewhere in the back, its wails cutting through the general murmur of conversation. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some weather-related delays. We'll be holding our position for approximately 20 minutes. A collective groan rose from the cabin. Claire's shoulders tensed as she anticipated the complaints that would surely follow. She wasn't disappointed. This is ridiculous, and I have a connection to make. Can we at least get some water while we wait? Claire moved through the cabin, trying to maintain order, when movement near the back caught her attention. An elderly man, shabby clothes, thick glasses, was struggling with his carry-on bag. His hands shook as he attempted to lift it into the overhead bin, the bag wobbling precariously. Under normal circumstances, Claire might have noticed the slight artificiality of his trembling hands, might have picked up on something not quite right about his appearance. But her patience had worn tissue thin, and all she saw was another passenger holding up the boarding process. Sir, she called out, her voice sharp with frustration. Move! Other people need to get to their seats. The man turned toward her, his expression unreadable behind those thick lenses. I apologize. I just need a moment to... Claire didn't let him finish. With years of handling luggage behind her, she reached past him and yanked the bag from his hands. The sudden motion caught him off guard, and he stumbled backward, colliding with a passenger who had been waiting behind him. As he tried to regain his balance, the man instinctively reached out, his hand moving toward Claire's arm. Without thinking, operating purely on stressed-out autopilot, Claire slapped his hand away. The sharp crack of skin against skin seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet cabin. Gasps rippled through the nearby rows. A young mother quickly covered her child's eyes. From first class, a businessman in an Italian suit muttered, "Figures. Loud enough to carry." The elderly man straightened slowly, adjusting his glasses with careful movements. He said nothing, but his gaze remained fixed on Claire's face for a long moment. Something about that steady look made her stomach twist uncomfortably. Jake, who had been helping passengers at the front of the plane, stood frozen, his usually cheerful expression replaced by shock. Even Janet, who had seen Claire through some of her worst days, looked stunned. Claire felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she pushed down the flicker of shame. She'd dealt with thousands of difficult passengers over the years. This was just one more. Without another word, she shoved the man's bag into the overhead bin and moved on to the next row, leaving him to settle into his seat. "Everything all right back here?" Jake asked quietly as she passed him. "Fine," Claire snapped. "Just another entitled passenger who doesn't know how to board a plane properly." But as she continued her pre-flight checks, she couldn't quite shake the feeling of those eyes watching her, couldn't completely ignore the whispers from nearby passengers. She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She had a job to do, and she'd do it, whether they liked her manner or not. The delayed departure time ticked by slowly as Claire moved through the cabin, steadfastly avoiding the section where the elderly man sat. She focused on her tasks with mechanical precision, checking seatbelts, ensuring tray tables were up, verifying that all bags were properly stowed. The younger flight attendants kept throwing glances her way, their expressions a mix of concern and disapproval. Claire ignored them too. They didn't understand what it was like, dealing with demanding passengers year after year, watching your dreams of travel and adventure turn into an endless cycle of complaints and entitled behavior. Still, as she passed row 23 again, she felt that same twinge of unease. The elderly man sat quietly in his seat, reading a magazine, but something about his composure felt off. Most passengers would have made a scene by now, demanded her name, threatened to report her. Claire pushed the thought away. She didn't have time for second-guessing herself. The weather delay would make the flight even more challenging, and she needed to stay focused. Without a backward glance, she moved toward the front of the plane, ready to begin the pre-flight safety demonstration. The afternoon flight had settled into its usual rhythm, the soft hum of engines providing a steady backdrop to the mundane tasks Claire performed. She pushed her beverage cart down the narrow aisle, her movements mechanical, her smile fixed and empty. The incident during boarding had already faded to the back of her mind, just another moment in an endless string of difficult encounters. "Coffee or soft drink?" she asked, row after row, her voice maintaining a professional tone despite her weariness. But something felt off. She noticed the subtle glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she passed. At first, she brushed it aside. Passengers always found something to gossip about. A celebrity in first class, perhaps, or some drama she'd missed during boarding. "Diet Coke, please," a woman in 23D requested, then immediately turned to whisper to her seatmate, both of them stealing quick looks toward the back of the plane. Claire's jaw tightened. Whatever was causing this ripple of attention, she didn't have the energy to care. She had 3 more hours of service to get through, countless demands to handle, and a mountain of paperwork waiting at the end of her shift. She was restocking her cart in the galley when Jake appeared, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by an unsettling pallor. His hands fidgeted with his tie as he approached, eyes darting around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Claire," he whispered urgently, grabbing her elbow and pulling her deeper into the galley. "We need to talk." She yanked her arm free, irritation flashing across her face. "Jake, I'm busy." "Whatever it is." "Claire, listen." His voice trembled slightly. "That man, the one you snapped at during boarding, the older gentleman you—" He swallowed hard. "That's Elijah Bryant." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her hands, which had been arranging cups on her cart, froze mid-motion. "What?" The word came out as barely more than a breath. "The CEO," Jake continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I recognized him from the company newsletter. He's wearing a disguise, but it's definitely him." Claire's stomach lurched. The cart suddenly seemed like the only thing keeping her upright as the full weight of what Jake was saying crashed over her. Her mind raced back to the boarding incident. The impatient words, the rough handling of his bag, and worst of all, the sharp slap when he'd reached out. She'd slapped away the hand of the CEO of Sky High Airlines. "You're sure?" she managed to ask, though she already knew the answer. The whispers, the looks, it all made horrible sense now. Jake nodded grimly. A passenger in first class recognized him too. It's spreading through the cabin. Claire forced herself to turn, to look down the aisle toward the back of the plane. There he sat, still in his deliberately disheveled clothing, calmly reading a magazine. Nothing in his posture suggested the power he held, the authority to end her career with a single word. "Oh God," she whispered, turning back to Jake. "What do I do?" "Act normal?" Jake suggested, though his uncertain tone made it sound more like a question. "Maybe he'll understand?" Claire almost laughed at the absurdity of that hope. In her 35 years of flying, she'd seen flight attendants fired for far less than physically striking a passenger, let alone the airline's CEO. The next hour passed in a fog of anxiety. Claire went through the motions of her duties, her hands trembling slightly as she served drinks, collected trash, and responded to call buttons. Each time she passed Elijah's row, she felt his presence like a physical weight, though he never once looked up or acknowledged her. The other passengers seemed to sense the tension. Conversations hushed when she passed, and she caught snippets of whispered discussions. The CEO didn't know it was him, saw her hit his hand. Her uniform felt too tight, the cabin too warm. Every announcement over the intercom made her jump, half expecting to hear her name called out, to be publicly dismissed mid-flight. The minutes dragged by like hours. Claire found herself checking her watch constantly, counting down the time until landing. Maybe if she could just get through this flight, she could slip away, figure out what to do next. But deep down, she knew better. There would be no easy escape from this situation. She was at the forward galley, mindlessly organizing supplies she'd already organized twice before, when she heard it. His voice, deep and measured, carried just far enough for her to hear clearly. "We'll talk after the flight." Claire's hands clenched around the pack of napkins she was holding, crumpling them. She didn't turn around, couldn't bear to face him, but she felt the weight of those words settle over her like a heavy blanket. 4 simple words that held her entire future in their grasp. The napkins in her hands were ruined now, crushed beyond use. She stared down at them, seeing in their wrinkled state a reflection of her own crumpled career. 35 years of service, countless miles in the air, thousands of passengers served, all potentially ending because of one moment of impatience with what she'd thought was just another difficult passenger. The wheels of the aircraft touched down at JFK with a gentle bump, but Claire's heart was hammering against her ribs. She moved through the landing procedures like a robot, her muscles remembering what her scattered mind couldn't focus on. The familiar announcements came out of her mouth automatically, though her voice wavered slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to John F. Kennedy International Airport. Local time is 4:45 p.m. and the temperature is 72 degrees. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor, carefully avoiding the row where Elijah sat. Each ding of the seatbelt sign felt like a countdown to her inevitable doom. She could feel sweat beating at the base of her neck, and her hands trembled as she checked the cabin for final safety compliance. Jake brushed past her, giving her a sympathetic look that only made her stomach twist harder. "Deep breaths," he whispered, but the gentle advice just made her more aware of how shallow her breathing had become. The aircraft door opened with its usual hiss, and Claire took her position for deplaning. She stood ramrod straight, hands clasped in front of her, mustering every ounce of professionalism she had left. The passengers began filing out, some still whispering, others oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. "Thank you for flying with us," she repeated mechanically, her voice barely above a whisper. Some passengers nodded, others ignored her completely. Each person who passed brought her closer to the moment she dreaded. Then Elijah was there, standing before her. Even in his disheveled disguise, she could now see the power that radiated from him. He paused, his eyes meeting hers for a long moment. Claire felt her throat close up, but he said nothing. He simply moved past her, his silence more terrifying than any immediate confrontation would have been. Claire's shoulders sagged with temporary relief as the last passengers trickled out. She began gathering her belongings, hands shaking as she collected her small crew bag. Maybe, just maybe, he would let this go. Write it up as a formal complaint. Give her a warning, anything but. Claire. Jake's voice was soft, almost apologetic. They want you in the executive lounge, now. The word now echoed in her head like a death knell. She gripped her bag tighter, the leather handle creaking under her white-knuckled grip. The walk through the terminal felt surreal, like moving through water. Her sensible shoes clicked against the polished floor, each step bringing her closer to what she was sure would be the end of her career. Passengers rushed past her, eager to reach their destinations. How many times had she walked these same corridors, confident and sure of her place in the world? Now, each step felt like she was walking to her own execution. The executive lounge doors loomed ahead, their polished wood suddenly intimidating. Claire paused, trying to steady her breathing. Through the frosted glass, she could make out a dim figure waiting inside. Her hand hovered over the door handle for a moment before she forced herself to grip it and push forward. The lounge was quiet, the usual bustle of the airport muted behind thick walls. Soft lighting cast gentle shadows across expensive leather furniture and abstract art. And there, standing by the window, was Elijah Bryant, transformed. Gone was the disheveled elderly passenger. In his place stood a commanding presence in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. His salt and pepper hair was now perfectly groomed, his posture straight and powerful. He turned to face her, his expression completely unreadable. Sit. His voice was deep and firm, not loud but carrying an unmistakable authority that made the single word feel like a physical force. Claire's legs felt like jelly as she lowered herself into one of the plush leather chairs. Her bag slipped from her trembling fingers and landed with a soft thud on the carpet. She folded her hands in her lap to hide their shaking, but she knew he must have noticed. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Elijah studied her face, his dark eyes intense and searching. When he finally spoke, his question knocked the air from her lungs. Tell me, Claire, why do you hate people like me? She sat there, mouth slightly open, caught completely off guard by the unexpected query. The question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer she wasn't prepared to give. Claire sat frozen in the plush leather chair of the executive lounge, her uniform suddenly feeling too tight around her neck. The question hung in the air between them, heavy and accusatory. Why do you hate people like me? Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The dim lighting cast shadows across Elijah Bryant's face, making his expression even harder to read. He sat there in his perfectly tailored suit, a far cry from the disheveled passenger she'd dismissed so cruelly hours before. I don't hate anyone, she finally managed, her voice smaller than she intended. The words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the polished mahogany table. No? His voice remained calm, measured. Then help me understand what happened on that plane today, Ms. Morgan. Because from where I was standing, or rather stumbling, it seemed very much like hatred, or at least a very specific kind of prejudice. Claire felt heat rising in her cheeks. That's not fair, I was just doing my job, we were running behind and… And what? Elijah cut in, still quiet but firm. You saw an elderly man struggling with his bag, and your response was to snap at him? To physically strike his hand away when he reached for support? He tilted his head, studying her. Would you have treated a well-dressed businessman the same way? Or was it because you thought I was just some poor old black man who didn't deserve your respect? The words hit Claire like physical blows. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she treated everyone the same way. But the memories of her recent interactions with passengers flashed through her mind. Had she really become so bitter, so judgmental? She started, then stopped. Her throat felt tight, and her hands trembled slightly in her lap. That's not who I am. No? Elijah reached down beside his chair and pulled out a leather briefcase. Because your recent passenger complaints tell a different story. He placed 2 documents on the table between them, sliding them toward her with one finger. You have a choice to make, Ms. Morgan. Claire stared at the papers, her vision blurring slightly. One was clearly a termination notice, the other a longer document with Sky High's corporate letterhead. Option 1, Elijah said, tapping the termination notice. You can sign this now. Walk away. Find another job, though I suspect with this incident on your record, that might be difficult in our industry. He moved his finger to the second document. Or option 2, you spend 1 week shadowing me at Sky High headquarters. See how this airline really works from the top down. Claire's head snapped up. What? Why would you? Because contrary to what you might think, Ms. Morgan, I don't enjoy firing people, especially not experienced employees who clearly used to love their job. He sat back in his chair. The question is, are you willing to learn, to really look at yourself and the assumptions you make about others? Claire's mind raced. She thought about her stack of unpaid medical bills at home, about the retirement she couldn't afford. Pride told her to grab the termination notice, to walk out with her head high. But reality whispered a harsher truth: she needed this job. She stared at the contract, her fingers twitching. 1 week. Just 1 week of humiliation, of being taught lessons like a child. But then what? What was his real game? What happens after the week? She asked, her voice hoarse. That depends entirely on you, Elijah replied simply. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a deep breath. When she opened them again, she reached for the contract, her movements stiff and reluctant. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. 1 week. That's it. Elijah nodded once, his expression unchanged. Then we start tomorrow. He stood up, straightening his jacket. 8 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. The harsh buzz of Claire's alarm pierced the pre-dawn darkness of her queen's apartment. She groaned, rolling over to silence it. The events of yesterday played through her mind like a bad movie. The slap, the revelation, and that impossible choice in the executive lounge. Her small bedroom felt even more cramped than usual this morning. The peeling wallpaper and worn carpet seemed to mock her situation. She'd meant to fix them up years ago, back when Tom was still alive. Now, like so many things, they remained unchanged. Just another reminder of dreams deferred by medical bills and reality. The phone rang just as she was buttoning up her blouse. Maggie's name flashed on the screen. Claire hesitated before answering, knowing her daughter's uncanny ability to read between the lines. Mom? You're up early, Maggie said, concern evident in her voice. Had to be. I'm heading into Manhattan today. Claire tried to keep her tone casual as she struggled with her hair in the mirror. Manhattan? But you never work flights out of there anymore. What's going on? Claire sighed, sitting heavily on the edge of her bed. I messed up bad at work. Now I have to fix it. Mom. Maggie's voice carried that familiar mix of worry and exasperation. What happened? Nothing I can't handle, Claire insisted, though her stomach churned at the lie. Just some workplace training thing. Right. Maggie's sigh crackled through the phone. You know, it wouldn't kill you to admit when you need help sometimes. I've got to go, honey. Kiss Tommy for me. Claire ended the call before Maggie could press further. An hour later, Claire stood before the towering glass facade of Sky High headquarters in Manhattan. The building seemed to stretch endlessly upward, its reflective surface throwing back the morning sun like a challenge. Inside, the lobby was all marble and chrome, filled with people in expensive suits rushing purposefully in every direction. Claire tugged self-consciously at her uniform. She'd ironed it twice this morning, but somehow it still felt shabby compared to the sleek outfits around her. A security guard directed her to the executive floor, where a young assistant led her to a large conference room. The room slowly filled with executives, each one giving her curious glances as they took their seats. Claire sat stiffly in her chair, feeling like an artifact in a museum, something to be studied and questioned. When Elijah Bryant entered, the energy in the room shifted instantly. Gone was any trace of the vulnerable old man she'd encountered on the plane. He moved with quiet authority, his tailored suit and commanding presence drawing every eye in the room. The executives straightened in their seats, laptops opening in perfect synchronization. Good morning, Elijah's voice carried easily across the room. Let's begin with the quarterly customer satisfaction review. A woman in a crisp pantsuit began presenting slides filled with graphs and statistics. Claire's attention drifted until certain words caught her ear. We're seeing a concerning trend in complaints about staff interactions, particularly among our flight attendants, the woman said, clicking to a new slide. Rudeness, dismissiveness, and lack of empathy are the most common issues cited. Claire's jaw clenched. She wanted to stand up and defend her colleagues, explain the impossible situations they dealt with daily. But she remained silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Claire. Elijah's voice cut through her thoughts. She looked up to find him watching her intently. What's the most common complaint you hear from passengers? The room fell silent. Claire could feel every eye on her. She swallowed hard before answering. Entitlement. A few executives exchanged glances. Elijah leaned forward slightly. Or maybe frustration? Excuse me? Claire felt her defenses rising. When someone's rushing to make a connection or traveling to a funeral or taking their kids on their first flight, maybe what you're seeing as entitlement is actually frustration, fear, anxiety. The words hit uncomfortably close to home. Claire remembered her own frustration when dealing with hospital billing departments during Tom's illness, how every interaction had felt like a battle. They still don't have the right to, she began, but Elijah cut her off with a raised hand. No one's saying bad behavior is acceptable, but understanding where it comes from might change how we respond to it. The meeting continued, but Claire barely heard it. She watched Elijah as he led discussions, asked pointed questions, and somehow managed to make every person in the room feel heard while still maintaining complete control. It was nothing like the meek old man she'd encountered on the plane, yet somehow exactly like him in the careful way he observed everything around him. As the meeting drew to a close, Claire found herself caught between resentment and an unwilling admiration. She hated that he might have a point about passenger behavior, hated even more that he'd managed to make her question her own assumptions so easily. The executives filed out, leaving Claire alone with her conflicted thoughts. She gathered her things slowly, still not ready to admit that maybe, just maybe, Elijah Bryant wasn't exactly who she'd assumed he was, and even less ready to admit that the same might be true about herself. Claire followed Elijah down the pristine hallway of Sky High's corporate headquarters, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The walls stretched endlessly, covered in perfectly arranged frames that seemed to mock her with their grandeur. Each photograph showed Elijah Bryant in various poses of success, shaking hands with senators, cutting ribbons at charity events, surrounded by smiling children in what looked like some inner-city school. Her eyes narrowed as they passed image after image. Everything was too perfect, too carefully arranged. The cynicism that had been building in her chest all morning finally bubbled over. Nice PR stunt, she muttered under her breath, not bothering to hide her disdain. Elijah stopped mid-stride. The sudden halt was so abrupt that Claire nearly walked into him. He turned slowly, his expression carefully controlled but his eyes sharp. Excuse me? His voice was quiet but carried an edge she hadn't heard before. Claire lifted her chin, past caring about consequences. All of this, she gestured at the walls. The photos with poor kids, the charity events, the perfectly staged moments of giving back. It's what all you corporate types do, right? Build your image. Something flickered in Elijah's eyes, a crack in his usual composed demeanor. You think this is about image? Isn't it? Claire crossed her arms. It's all calculated. Every donation, every photo op, every carefully chosen moment to look like you care about the little people. Must be nice to have enough money to buy a good reputation. Elijah stepped closer, his presence suddenly filling the hallway. I don't need PR, Claire. I've been building this company for 20 years. What have you built? The words hit her like a slap. Claire felt heat rise to her face. Oh, that's rich. You want to compare achievements? Must be easy to build something when you're handed every advantage. Handed? Elijah's voice cut through her words like steel. For the first time since she'd met him, real anger showed on his face. You think I was handed success? Weren't you? Claire shot back, her own anger rising. Look at all this. She waved her arm at their surroundings. The marble floors, the fancy artwork, the golden name on the wall. You probably had connections, money, everything lined up nice and neat. Do you even know what struggle looks like? Elijah's words were razor sharp now. He took another step forward, and Claire found herself backing up despite her resolve to stand her ground. You think you have me all figured out, don't you? The privileged CEO who's never known a hard day's work? Am I wrong? Claire challenged, though something in his tone made her stomach twist uncomfortably. Spectacularly, his jaw clenched. But you're so caught up in your own bitterness that you can't see past your assumptions. You look at these photos and see PR stunts. I look at them and see promises kept. Promises to who? To myself. To my mother. To every kid who grew up like I did, believing success wasn't possible for people like us. His voice had dropped to a dangerous quiet. But you'd rather believe your own narrative, wouldn't you? Claire stood her ground even as doubt began to creep in. Anyone can make up a good story. Elijah's laugh was sharp and humorless. A story? You want to talk about stories? He pointed to one of the photos, him with a group of teenagers in what looked like a community center. That's where I grew up. Those kids are standing in the same spot where I used to do my homework because we couldn't afford electricity. But please, tell me more about how success was handed to me. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire's certainty wavered, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with defiance she didn't entirely feel. Elijah studied her for a long moment, his anger settling into something colder. Finally, he exhaled sharply and turned toward a nearby elevator, pressing the button with more force than necessary. Tomorrow, he said, his voice clipped, you'll see exactly where I came from. Be ready. Claire watched him, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and curiosity. She had no idea what he meant, but something in his tone told her tomorrow would be unlike anything she expected. The black SUV glided through Manhattan's morning traffic, its tinted windows shielding Claire and Elijah from the outside world. Claire sat stiffly in her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She expected another day of corporate meetings, another round of being made to feel small and ignorant. But as the sleek buildings of Manhattan gave way to more modest neighborhoods, confusion crept across her face. The car turned into the Bronx, passing worn storefronts and apartment buildings with faded paint. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her seat, watching as they drove deeper into a neighborhood that seemed worlds away from the glossy corporate headquarters they'd left behind. The SUV finally pulled up to a weathered brick apartment building. Paint peeled from the window frames, and a rusty fire escape zigzagged up the facade. Claire frowned, her forehead creasing. Why are we here? Elijah didn't answer immediately. He stepped out of the car and waited for Claire to follow. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sounds of distant traffic and children playing in a nearby schoolyard. Claire's heels clicked against the cracked sidewalk as she reluctantly followed him toward the building's entrance. They climbed 3 flights of stairs, the wooden steps creaking under their feet. The hallway smelled of old carpet and cooking spices. Elijah stopped at apartment 3C and knocked gently on the door. After a moment, it opened to reveal an elderly black woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face lit up with recognition. Elijah Bryant! Oh my lord! She threw her arms around him, and Claire watched in amazement as the powerful CEO she knew melted into the embrace like a young boy coming home. Ms. Green, Elijah said warmly, hugging her back. It's so good to see you. Look at you, Ms. Green held him at arm's length, examining him with motherly pride. All grown up in your fancy suit, but still my Elijah. She noticed Claire standing awkwardly behind him. And who's this? This is Claire Morgan, one of our flight attendants. Claire, this is Ms. Green. She lived next door to my mother and me when I was growing up. Ms. Green ushered them inside. The apartment was small but immaculately kept, with plastic-covered furniture and family photos covering every available surface. The living room window looked out over a small playground where children were running and shouting. Sit, Ms. Green insisted, gesturing to the plastic-covered couch. Claire perched uncomfortably on the edge while Elijah sat with the ease of someone who'd done this many times before. "How's the arthritis, Ms. Green?" Elijah asked. "Oh, much better since you helped me get that new doctor, but never mind about me." She turned to Claire. "Has he told you about growing up here?" Claire shook her head, and Ms. Green settled into her worn armchair, her eyes growing distant with memory. His mama, God rest her soul, worked herself to the bone for this boy. 3 jobs she worked, cleaning offices at night, doing laundry during the day, and on weekends she cleaned at the airport. Ms. Green's voice softened. "Sometimes I'd watch little Elijah when she had to work late. Such a serious child, always with his nose in a book." Claire sat perfectly still, her earlier defensiveness giving way to an uncomfortable awareness. She watched Elijah's face as Ms. Green continued. "There were nights they didn't have enough to eat. I'd make extra soup, pretend I'd made too much." Ms. Green shook her head. "His mama was too proud to take charity, but she'd accept it if I said it would go to waste otherwise." "Ms. Green's soup was the best in the building," Elijah added quietly. "Remember that winter the heating went out?" Ms. Green asked. "You and your mama stayed with me for 3 days. You were, what, 12? Sitting there doing your homework by candlelight, determined to keep your grades up." Claire's throat felt tight. She thought of her own assumptions about Elijah, that he was just another privileged executive who'd never known struggle. The reality of his childhood sat heavily in her chest. "He was always helping other kids with their schoolwork," Ms. Green continued. "Even then, he was looking out for others. When he got that scholarship to college, the whole building celebrated. His mama, ... Ms. Green's voice caught. His mama cried for joy." Claire watched as Elijah reached over and squeezed Ms. Green's hand. The gesture was so gentle, so unlike the stern CEO she thought she knew. After sharing tea and more stories, they said their goodbyes. Ms. Green hugged Elijah again and even gave Claire a warm embrace that made her feel both welcome and ashamed. The walk back to the SUV was silent. Claire's mind was spinning with everything she'd learned. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and somewhere nearby, children laughed on their way to school. It was the same neighborhood they'd arrived in, but somehow it looked different to her now. As they reached the vehicle, Claire finally found her voice. "I didn't know," she muttered, the words feeling inadequate even as she spoke them. Elijah's response was quiet but clear as he opened the car door. "You never cared to." The black SUV pulled into the underground parking garage of Sky High headquarters, the engine's purr fading to silence. Claire stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched tight. The visit to the Bronx kept replaying in her mind. Ms. Green's warm smile, the stories of struggle, the tiny apartment where a future billionaire once went hungry. She didn't want these thoughts, didn't want to feel this growing unease in her chest. Elijah stepped out first, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete. Claire followed, maintaining careful distance between them. The elevator ride was suffocating in its silence. She could feel Elijah's presence beside her, that usual commanding energy now wrapped in something quieter, more contemplative. The moment they stepped onto the executive floor, Elijah turned to face her. He crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "What did you learn?" Claire's defenses shot up immediately. She straightened her uniform jacket, a habit from years of facing difficult passengers. "I don't know what you want me to say." "I want you to stop making excuses," Elijah said, his voice level but carrying an edge of steel. "You judged me without knowing a thing about me." A bitter laugh escaped Claire's throat. "Oh, that's rich. You act like you know everything about me too." She gestured at the floor-to-ceiling windows, the expensive artwork on the walls. "You sit up here in your glass tower pretending you understand what people like me go through." Something shifted in Elijah's eyes. The careful control he'd maintained all day cracked slightly. His voice dropped, becoming dangerously quiet. "You don't have a monopoly on hardship, Claire. You think you're the only one who's suffered?" The words hit Claire like a physical blow. All the frustration, all the bitterness she'd been carrying bubbled to the surface. "I buried my husband in debt, wondering if I'd even have a home left." Her voice cracked. "Meanwhile, you're running an empire." Elijah took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. "And yet," he said softly, "you still assume the worst in others." Claire felt her chest tighten. The walls seemed to close in around her. Without another word, she turned and stormed toward the elevator, her heels striking the marble floor like angry punctuation marks. She could feel Elijah's eyes on her back as she jabbed the elevator button repeatedly. Behind her, she heard Elijah sigh heavily. She refused to look back as the elevator doors opened and she stepped inside. The last thing she saw before the doors closed was Elijah standing there, his shoulders slightly slumped, watching her retreat. The weight of unspoken words hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Claire's hands trembled as she pressed the lobby button, her carefully maintained composure finally starting to crack. Claire stood in the employee entrance of O'Hare International Airport, staring at the navy blue customer service vest in her hands. The material felt foreign, scratchy and stiff, nothing like her familiar flight attendant uniform. She looked up at Elijah, who wore that infuriating little smirk she was beginning to know all too well. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice flat. "Dead serious." Elijah's expression didn't waver. "The check-in desk needs extra help today. You'll be working with Tasha. She's one of our best." Claire's fingers tightened around the vest. "I'm a senior flight attendant. I don't do check-in." "Today you do." He checked his watch. "Your shift starts in 10 minutes. Better hurry." Claire muttered under her breath as she pulled the vest over her blouse. The walk to the check-in area felt like a walk of shame. She spotted Tasha right away, a woman in her mid-30s with warm brown skin and perfectly braided hair, greeting passengers with a genuine smile that Claire hadn't managed in years. "You must be Claire." Tasha's enthusiasm was almost painful to witness. "Mr. Bryant said you'd be helping today. Let me show you the system." The next few minutes were a blur of computer commands and procedures. Claire's head spun with baggage codes, fee structures, and seat assignment protocols. Before she could properly process it all, the morning rush began. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" Tasha's cheerful voice rang out as she helped her first customer. Claire grimaced and turned to face her own line. A businessman in an expensive suit approached her counter, already scowling. "This is ridiculous. I've been waiting for 15 minutes. Claire felt her usual sharp response rising, but caught herself. She wasn't in the air now. She was stuck here, behind this counter, with Elijah probably watching her every move. "I apologize for the wait, sir. Where are you traveling to today?" The man practically threw his passport at her. "London, business class, and I need this bag checked through to my final destination." Claire typed with painful slowness, still learning the system. The man drummed his fingers on the counter. "Could you possibly move any slower?" Her jaw clenched. She thought of all the times she'd been short with passengers on her flights. It felt different being on this side of the counter, somehow more exposed. The morning wore on. A young mother struggled with 3 kids and too many bags. An elderly couple needed help understanding the self-check-in kiosk. A group of college students argued about seat assignments. Claire's feet ached, her head throbbed, and her patience wore thinner by the minute. Then came the baggage fee dispute. "What do you mean I have to pay extra?" A red-faced man in his 50s leaned over the counter. "This is highway robbery." "Sir, the weight limit is clearly stated," Claire started. "I fly this airline all the time. I've never had to pay before." "Well, you're over the limit now," Claire snapped, her composure finally cracking. "Either pay the fee or remove some items." The man's face turned purple. "I want to speak to your supervisor." Claire opened her mouth to fire back, but then she caught sight of Elijah standing near a pillar, watching. She swallowed hard and forced herself to take a deep breath. "I apologize, sir. Let me explain our baggage policy in detail and we can look at some options." The next challenge came in the form of an elderly woman with thick glasses and trembling hands. She couldn't understand the passport scanner, and Claire felt her impatience rising again. "Ma'am, you need to place it face down." "Here, let me help with that." Tasha smoothly stepped in, her voice gentle. "Sometimes these machines can be tricky. There we go. Perfect. Are you visiting your grandchildren?" The old woman's face lit up. Yes, my daughter just had twins. Claire watched as Tasha handled the interaction with grace and genuine interest. She remembered, suddenly, how she used to be that way. Before the bills, before the bitterness, before she started seeing every passenger as an enemy. By the end of her shift, Claire's feet were killing her. She'd dealt with more crying children, angry executives, and confused tourists than she could count. Her throat felt raw from talking, and her cheeks hurt from forcing smiles. As she headed toward the employee exit, she caught sight of Elijah. He stood near the security checkpoint, his expression thoughtful as he nodded slightly in her direction. Claire felt something shift inside her. Not quite understanding, not quite acceptance, but something was definitely changing. She pulled off the customer service vest, her fingers lingering on the material. For the first time in years, she'd truly seen the other side of air travel. The endless lines, the constant complaints, the need for endless patience. She thought of all the times she'd rolled her eyes at gate agents or dismissed their struggles. The walk to her car was quiet, her mind unusually full. She was exhausted, but it wasn't just physical tiredness. Something else weighed on her, something that felt uncomfortably like self-reflection. Claire stared at her phone, reading Elijah's text message for the third time. Be at the Langford Hotel 7 p.m. Don't be late. Her stomach churned. The Langford was one of Chicago's most exclusive hotels, where rooms cost more than her monthly salary. She stood in front of her closet, frantically pushing hangers aside. Everything looked too worn, too ordinary. Finally, she pulled out her one decent black dress, the one she'd worn to her husband's funeral 2 years ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed out the wrinkles. At 6:45 p.m., Claire stepped out of a taxi in front of the Langford's gleaming entrance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting warm light onto the sidewalk. A doorman in an impeccable uniform held the door open, and Claire forced herself to walk through with her head high. The lobby took her breath away. Marble floors stretched out beneath her feet, and the ceiling soared 2 stories above. Well-dressed people moved purposefully through the space, their designer clothes and confident strides making Claire feel like she'd wandered into another world. Following the signs to the hotel's prestigious restaurant, Claire's heels clicked softly against the polished floor. Each step felt like an intrusion into a place she didn't belong. Through the restaurant's entrance, she spotted Elijah immediately. He sat at a private table in a corner, surrounded by men and women in expensive suits. Their postures radiated authority, and their conversation flowed with the easy familiarity of people used to wielding power. Elijah looked completely in his element, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Claire's car. As she approached, conversations at nearby tables hushed. Claire felt eyes following her, measuring her, judging her. She recognized some faces from business magazines and news reports, CEOs, board members, people who could buy and sell companies on a whim. Elijah stood as she reached the table, gesturing to an empty chair. Claire, welcome. Please join us. His voice carried the same calm authority it always did. But there was something else there, a subtle challenge to anyone who might question her presence. Thank you, Claire managed, trying to keep her voice steady as she sat down. A waiter appeared instantly, filling her water glass and presenting a leather-bound menu she was afraid to open. A man across the table cleared his throat. Elijah, a word. His steel-gray hair and expensive watch screamed corporate power. Claire recognized him from the photos in Sky High's headquarters. Jonathan Pierce, Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs. Elijah's expression didn't change. Of course, Jonathan. We can all hear what you have to say. Pierce's smile didn't reach his eyes. You're aware this situation is controversial? His gaze flicked to Claire before returning to Elijah. The board has concerns about how this might appear to our shareholders. The table fell silent. Claire's chest tightened as she realized they were discussing her, the flight attendant who'd slapped away the CEO's hand, now sitting among the company's elite. Elijah set down his water glass with deliberate care. Claire is here because she earned the right to be. His voice was quiet, but carried an unmistakable edge of authority. And I trust everyone at this table understands that my decisions regarding staff development are not up for debate. Pierce's smile tightened further. Other executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke. Claire sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. She'd expected Elijah to distance himself from her in front of these people, to treat her like the liability she surely was. Instead, he'd just defended her to some of the most powerful people in the company. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of unfamiliar dishes and careful conversation. Claire watched as Elijah navigated complex discussions about market shares and international expansion with ease. He commanded respect without raising his voice, led without demanding attention. It was a side of him she'd never seen before. As the evening drew to a close, Claire gathered her purse and stood. Her mind was spinning with questions, chief among them. Why? Why was Elijah Bryant, who could have easily fired her and avoided all this controversy, choosing to give her a chance? Why was he willing to stake his reputation on someone who'd treated him so poorly? She watched him bid goodbye to the other executives, noting how even Pierce seemed to defer to him despite his earlier challenge. This was Elijah's world, a world of power, influence, and carefully calculated moves. Yet he'd brought her into it, defended her place at the table. As she walked toward the hotel's entrance, Claire felt the weight of the evening settling on her shoulders. The doorman called a taxi for her, and as she waited, she couldn't shake the question that kept circling in her mind. Why was Elijah giving her this chance? Claire walked into work the next morning, her shoulders tense. Something felt different. The usual morning bustle of the crew lounge had a strange edge to it. Conversations died as she passed, only to resume in hushed whispers once she was out of earshot. She kept her head high, though her stomach twisted with anxiety. A group of younger flight attendants huddled near the coffee machine, stealing glances her way. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and judgment. "Did you hear?" one whispered, not quite quiet enough. "The board is furious." Claire quickened her pace, heading for her locker. Her hands shook slightly as she turned the combination lock. The metal door creaked open, and she busied herself with arranging her uniform, trying to ignore the weight of stares on her back. "Claire." Janet's familiar voice made her jump. Her friend stood behind her, concern etched deep in her weathered face. "We need to talk." Janet grabbed Claire's arm gently but firmly, steering her toward the small break room at the end of the hall. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Janet closed the door behind them, checking to make sure they were alone. "What's going on?" Claire asked, though part of her already knew. Janet sighed, running a hand through her graying hair. "The executives are pushing to have you fired," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's bad, Claire. Really bad." Claire sank into one of the worn plastic chairs, her legs suddenly weak. "How do you know?" "I overheard Marcus from HR talking to the chief of operations." Janet pulled up a chair next to her. "They're saying keeping you on is a liability, that it sends the wrong message." Claire's throat tightened. "Wrong message?" "That employees can disrespect leadership without consequences." Janet's eyes were sympathetic, but direct. "Some board members are arguing that if Elijah lets this slide, it could encourage others to challenge authority." The words hit Claire like a physical blow. She'd been so caught up in her own drama with Elijah that she hadn't considered the bigger picture. Of course the board would be concerned. She'd essentially assaulted their CEO in front of a plane full of witnesses. "They're right," Claire whispered, more to herself than Janet. "What?" "The board. They're right." Claire stood up, pacing the small break room. "I'm making things worse for him, aren't I? He's trying to protect me, and I'm becoming a burden." Janet watched her friend with worried eyes. "Elijah must see something in you worth fighting for. Or maybe he's just too stubborn to admit he made a mistake giving me a second chance." Claire's voice cracked slightly. "Did you know what some people are saying? That he's showing favoritism? That he's weak for not firing me on the spot?" The break room door opened and both women fell silent as Jake poked his head in. His usually cheerful face was serious. "5 minutes until briefing," he said, then hesitated. "Claire, you okay?" She forced a smile. "Fine. Thanks, Jake." Once he left, Janet touched Claire's arm. "Don't give up yet, Elijah Dash." "Elijah can't protect me forever," Claire cut her off. "And he shouldn't have to." The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Claire went through the motions, safety demonstrations, drink service, passenger assistance, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she caught a colleague whispering or saw a passenger giving her a strange look, she wondered if they knew, if they were judging not just her, but Elijah for keeping her around. That evening, Claire stood in her small apartment bedroom, staring at her open closet. With mechanical movements, she began pulling out uniforms, folding them carefully on her bed. Each crisp navy blazer represented years of service, of pride in her work. Now they felt like symbols of her failure. She found an old cardboard box in the hall closet and began packing away her things. Her wing's pin caught the light as she placed it in the box, and for a moment, she remembered receiving it at her graduation ceremony. How proud she'd been. How full of hope for the future. A photo fell from between some papers, her and Janet at a crew party years ago, both laughing at some forgotten joke. Claire's smile in the picture was genuine, reaching her eyes. When was the last time she'd smiled like that? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, a text from her daughter Maggie. "Mom? You've been quiet. Everything okay?" Claire stared at the message, fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain? How could she tell her daughter that she'd thrown away decades of work because she couldn't control her own bitterness? She set the phone down without responding and returned to her packing. The clock on her kitchen wall ticked loudly in the silence as she worked. 8:45 p.m. Somewhere across the city, Elijah was probably still at the office dealing with the fallout of her actions, fighting battles she'd created for him. Claire sank into a kitchen chair surrounded by half-packed boxes. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in. She watched the clock's hands move slowly forward, each tick another reminder that her time at Sky High was running out. Maybe it would be better this way. Leave on her own terms before they forced her out. Give Elijah an easy exit instead of making him choose between his principles and his board's demands. She'd caused enough trouble already. The clock struck 9, and Claire remained at her kitchen table, motionless except for her fingers tracing patterns on the worn wooden surface. Each tick of the clock felt like a countdown to the inevitable. She knew Elijah wouldn't be able to protect her forever. Maybe it was time to leave before he was forced to make the decision for her. The dim lights of the airport bar cast long shadows across the polished wood counter. Claire Morgan sat alone, her fingers wrapped around a glass of whiskey she'd barely touched. The ice had mostly melted, turning the amber liquid pale. Her navy blue uniform felt heavy on her shoulders, like armor she no longer deserved to wear. The bartender wiped glasses at the other end, occasionally glancing her way with practiced disinterest. A few travelers sat scattered around the bar, lost in their own worlds of delayed flights and missed connections. The muted CNN broadcast above the bar droned on about weather patterns and flight delays. Claire reached into her bag, pulling out the resignation letter she'd typed up that morning. The paper felt flimsy in her hands, like it might dissolve if she held it too long. 28 years of service, reduced to 3 paragraphs and a signature. "I saved you the trouble of firing me," she said without turning around, recognizing the steady footsteps approaching behind her. She knew it was Elijah. Somehow she'd expected him to find her here. The stool beside her creaked as Elijah settled onto it. He was back in his CEO attire, crisp charcoal suit, perfectly knotted tie, leather shoes that probably cost more than her monthly rent. But there was something different about him now. The intimidating corporate mask had slipped slightly, revealing something more human underneath. "Scotch, neat," he told the bartender, then turned to face Claire. "You know, for someone who's worked in aviation this long, you're surprisingly bad at disappearing." Claire snorted softly, finally taking a sip of her watered-down whiskey. Wasn't trying to disappear, just making things easier for everyone. "Is that what you think you're doing?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made Claire finally look at him. He placed a manila folder on the bar between them, its edges crisp and clean compared to her wrinkled resignation letter. "What's that?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Probably termination papers, carefully prepared by corporate lawyers to protect the airline from any potential lawsuits. Open it. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the folder. The bar's overhead light caught the gold sky-high logo embossed on its surface. She took a deep breath and flipped it open. Her eyes widened as she scanned the first page. This wasn't a termination notice. It was a contract, a promotion. Senior trainer for sky-high flight attendants. The salary listed made her breath catch. Why? The word came out as barely more than a whisper. She looked up at Elijah, searching his face for some sign this was a cruel joke. He took a slow sip of his scotch before answering. Because I believe in second chances. His dark eyes met hers steadily. And because you're exactly what we need. Claire shook her head, pushing the folder away. Number, I'm not. You've seen how I treat people. The board wants me gone. Hell, half the crew probably wants me gone. The board doesn't make these decisions, I do. Elijah's voice was firm. And what I've seen this week is someone who needed a wake-up call. Someone who lost their way but hasn't forgotten how to find it again. You don't know that, Claire protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I know you stayed late yesterday helping Tasha train new check-in staff. I know you gave your lunch to that stranded passenger with diabetes. I know the real Claire Morgan is still in there, under all that bitterness. Claire felt her throat tighten. She hadn't realized he'd noticed those small moments, hadn't even really noticed them herself. The position is yours if you want it, Elijah continued. You'll train new flight attendants, mentor existing ones. Show them how to handle difficult situations with grace, something you used to be very good at. He stood up, straightening his jacket. You can quit if you want, but if you do, don't pretend it's because of me. He laid a business card on top of the folder. You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Claire watched as he walked away, his footsteps fading into the general airport noise. She sat there for a long time, staring at the contract, her resignation letter crumpled, forgotten beside it. The choice was now in her hands. Her whiskey sat untouched, the ice completely melted now. The bartender raised an eyebrow, silently offering another, but Claire shook her head. She needed a clear head for this decision. The contract seemed to glow under the bar's dim lighting. Senior trainer. A chance to shape the next generation of flight attendants. A chance to make things right. But more than that, a chance to remember who she used to be before grief and bitterness had hardened her heart. Claire picked up the folder with trembling hands, running her fingers over the embossed logo. The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than any carry-on bag she'd ever lifted. Claire tossed and turned all night in her small Queens apartment, her mind racing with thoughts of Elijah's offer. The promotion papers lay on her nightstand, casting a shadow in the dim light of passing cars. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw faces. The elderly man she'd humiliated, Elijah's quiet dignity, Ms. Green's warm smile in the Bronx, and Tasha's patient handling of difficult customers. When her alarm finally buzzed at 5 a.m., she hadn't slept more than a couple of hours. She sat up, rubbing her tired eyes, and looked at the folder again. The morning light was just beginning to peek through her worn curtains, casting a soft glow on the papers that could change her life. In her tiny bathroom, Claire stared at herself in the mirror as she got ready. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper, her gray-streaked hair a testament to years of stress and struggle. But something was different this morning. The bitterness that usually clouded her expression had softened. She took extra care with her uniform, making sure every crease was perfect. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned her senior flight attendant wings to her lapel. Would this be the last time she wore them, or the beginning of something new? The subway ride to Manhattan felt endless. Claire clutched the folder to her chest, watching the underground darkness flash by through the windows. A young mother struggled with a stroller near her seat, and without thinking, Claire stood up to help. The woman's grateful smile stirred something inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Sky High headquarters loomed before her, its glass exterior reflecting the morning sun. Claire's heart pounded as she walked through the revolving doors. The security guard, Tom, she remembered his name now, gave her a friendly nod. Yesterday she might have ignored him. Today she nodded back, The elevator ride to the executive floor was silent except for the soft hum of machinery. Claire watched the numbers climb, each floor bringing her closer to a decision she'd already made somewhere between midnight and dawn. Her reflection in the polished elevator doors showed a woman standing straighter, chin lifted with determination rather than defiance. The executive floor was quiet this early in the morning. A few early bird employees hurried past, coffee cups in hand. Claire walked purposefully toward Elijah's office, her heels clicking against the marble floor. His assistant wasn't at her desk yet, but the light in his office was already on. Through the glass walls, she could see him working at his desk, completely focused on whatever document lay before him. He wore a charcoal gray suit today, his presence as commanding as ever. But now she saw something else too, the subtle signs of someone who had fought his way to the top, who understood struggle intimately. Claire knocked softly on the doorframe. Elijah looked up, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes alert and watchful. He gestured for her to enter without speaking. The office was warm and surprisingly inviting, with comfortable leather chairs and photographs of Sky High's history on the walls. Claire noticed one she hadn't seen before, a much younger Elijah standing proudly next to his mother at what looked like the airline's first terminal. She walked to his desk, her fingers tight around the folder. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The CEO who had every right to fire her but chose not to, and the flight attendant who had finally learned to see beyond her own pain. Claire placed the signed contract on his desk, sliding it toward him with steady hands. "Tell me what I have to do," she said, her voice firm and clear. Elijah picked up the contract, checking her signature. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he leaned back in his chair. "Then let's get started." For the first time since her husband's death, since the medical bills started piling up, since bitterness had become her closest companion, Claire didn't feel like she was fighting anymore. The constant tension in her shoulders eased slightly. The defensive words that usually sat ready on her tongue dissolved. She lowered herself into one of the leather chairs, ready to listen, ready to learn. Maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to change. Claire stood outside the gleaming glass doors of Sky High Airline's training facility, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the thick folder of training materials. The morning sun reflected off the building's modern exterior, making her squint. She'd walked through these doors countless times before, but never like this. Never as an instructor. The weight of the responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. Teaching others? Her? The same woman who'd let bitterness poison her attitude for years? She almost laughed at the irony. Taking a deep breath, Claire smoothed her navy blazer and checked her reflection in the glass. Her gray-streaked hair was neatly pulled back, her uniform crisp and professional. But the worry lines around her eyes betrayed her anxiety. "You can do this," she muttered to herself, pushing through the doors. The click of her sensible shoes echoed through the hallway as she made her way to Training Room 3. Through the glass panels, she could see them, 15 fresh faces all seated and waiting. Some chatted quietly among themselves, while others sat straight-backed and alert. They looked so young, so full of hope. Claire remembered being like that once before life had worn her down. She hesitated at the door, her hand on the handle. The folder felt heavy in her arms, filled with protocols, procedures, and carefully crafted presentations. But what did she really have to offer these people? With one final deep breath, Claire pushed open the door. The quiet chatter immediately ceased as 15 pairs of eyes turned to her. She walked to the front of the room, setting her materials on the desk with hands she prayed weren't visibly shaking. "Good morning," she began, her voice coming out more uncertain than she'd intended. "I'm Claire Morgan, and I'll be your primary instructor for the next 6 weeks." She caught a whispered exchange between two young women in the front row. One leaned over to the other, covering her mouth. Claire didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. News traveled fast in the airline industry. Everyone knew about the incident with Elijah. Claire felt her cheeks flush as she fumbled with the papers, dropping several onto the floor. As she bent to retrieve them, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. Through the glass panels of the door, she saw him, Elijah Bryant, standing with his arms crossed, watching intently. His expression was unreadable, but his presence made her pulse quicken. Get it together, she told herself firmly. You earned this chance, don't waste it. Standing up straight, Claire set the papers aside and looked at the faces before her. Some looked skeptical, others curious, and a few seemed genuinely eager to learn. She took a moment to really see them, not just as a group of trainees but as individuals, each with their own stories and dreams. I was supposed to start with a PowerPoint presentation about company policies, she said, moving away from behind the desk. But instead, let's be honest, this job isn't easy. You'll meet passengers who test your patience, who push you to your limit. But you have a choice every time. You can either make their day better or worse. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from years of experience and hard-learned lessons. She saw a few trainees sit up straighter, their attention caught. I've been where you are, Claire continued, her voice growing stronger. I've dealt with delayed flights, crying babies, angry businessmen, and everything in between. I've had good days when this job felt like the greatest in the world, and bad days when I wanted to quit on the spot. She paced slowly across the front of the room, making eye contact with each trainee. But here's what I've learned, and what I'm still learning. Every passenger who steps onto that plane is a human being with their own struggles. Maybe they're flying to a funeral. Maybe they're terrified of flying but have to do it for work. Maybe they saved for months just to afford that ticket. Claire glanced toward the door again, but Elijah had vanished. Still, she could feel his presence, his challenge to her to prove herself worthy of this second chance. Your job isn't just about serving drinks or demonstrating safety procedures, she said, warming to her subject. It's about being the face of compassion and professionalism, even when, especially when, it's difficult. A young man in the back raised his hand. But how do you handle it when passengers are really rude? Claire smiled, remembering her own struggles with that very question. That's exactly the kind of real-world situation we're going to discuss. Because trust me, it will happen. And how you handle it matters, not just for the airline, but for your own peace of mind. For the next hour, Claire led them through scenarios she'd faced herself, encouraging discussion and sharing both her successes and failures. The initial tension in the room gradually dissolved as the trainees engaged, asking questions and sharing their own concerns. When the session ended, Claire felt drained but oddly energized. The trainees filed out, several of them smiling and thanking her. She gathered her materials, surprised to realize she'd barely looked at them during the entire class. Standing alone in the empty room, Claire exhaled deeply, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of real purpose. She glanced toward the door where Elijah had stood, but the hallway was empty now. No words of praise or criticism, just the space to find her own way. She'd spent years going through the motions, letting bitterness cloud her vision. But standing here now, preparing to guide these newcomers, she felt something different stirring inside her. Something that felt surprisingly like hope. Claire sat in the sky-high employee lounge, absently stirring her coffee. The morning rush had settled, leaving behind the gentle hum of distant conversations and the faint scent of brewing coffee. Her training materials lay spread across the table, covered in sticky notes and highlighter marks. A shadow fell across her papers. Claire looked up to find a young flight attendant hovering nearby, hands clasped tightly in front of her uniform. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion, though her uniform was perfectly pressed. "Can I help you?" Claire asked, softer than she would have just weeks ago. The young woman shifted her weight from foot to foot. "I'm Sophia," she said, then blurted out, "I heard what happened with you and Mr. Bryant." Claire's stomach tightened. Of course the story had spread. She waited for judgment, for criticism, but Sophia's next words surprised her. "How did you bounce back?" The question caught Claire off guard. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit down." Sophia slid into the seat, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Up close, Claire could see the telltale signs of stress: bitten nails, tired eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged her skirt. "I'm thinking of quitting," Sophia admitted in a rush. I can't handle it anymore. The way passengers look at me like I'm beneath them, the constant demands, the complaints." She trailed off, blinking rapidly. Claire felt an uncomfortable twinge of recognition. How many times had she stood in the crew bathroom fighting back tears of frustration? How many times had she wanted to throw her wings badge in the trash and walk away? "How long have you been flying?" Claire asked. 8 months. Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Everyone said it would get easier, but it's getting harder. Yesterday, a first-class passenger called me stupid because I couldn't find his special-ordered meal fast enough." Claire winced. She remembered similar incidents, remembered how each one had added another brick to the wall she'd built around herself. "Were you always like this?" Sophia asked suddenly, then immediately looked mortified. I'm sorry, that came out wrong." But Claire understood the question. She stared into her coffee cup, watching the liquid swirl. "No," she said finally. "No, I used to love this job." The admission felt like pulling out a splinter, painful but necessary. And then, life got in the way. She thought about her husband's illness, the mounting medical bills, the endless nights wondering how she'd keep their house. Each worry had been another drop of poison in her well of compassion until it had turned bitter. "I used to get excited about every flight," Claire continued. "I loved helping people, loved being part of their journeys. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing passengers as people. I started seeing them as burdens." Sophia nodded eagerly. "That's how I feel now, like everyone's just waiting for me to fail." Claire saw herself reflected in Sophia's eyes, the same fear, the same defensiveness she'd carried for years. She finally understood what Elijah had been trying to show her. He hadn't just been teaching her about customer service. He'd been showing her how she'd let her personal pain cloud her view of others. "You know what I learned recently?" Claire leaned forward. "When we're hurting, we start seeing hurt everywhere. We expect the worst from people because we're expecting the worst from life." Sophia's eyes welled with tears. "So what do I do?" Claire reached across the table and squeezed the young woman's hand. "Give yourself time," she said gently. "The job isn't easy, but neither is giving up." A small spark of hope flickered in Sophia's eyes. She wiped her cheeks and managed a wobbly smile. "Thank you," she whispered. I think I needed to hear that." Claire watched as Sophia stood and straightened her uniform, looking a little lighter than when she'd first approached. The young flight attendant gave her one last grateful look before walking away, her steps more purposeful than before. A week had passed since Claire's conversation with Sophia in the lounge. Now she stood at the gate for Flight 2187 to Dallas, her hands steady as she checked her tablet one last time. The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, casting long shadows across the carpeted floor. Her collar felt unusually tight, and she tugged at it, trying to ignore the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "He's already boarded," Jake whispered as he passed by with a stack of blankets. "Seat 3A. Claire nodded, keeping her expression neutral. Of course, Elijah would choose today for her evaluation. A short-haul flight to Dallas, simple enough on paper, but with him watching her every move, it felt like walking a tightrope. The boarding process began smoothly. Claire greeted each passenger with a genuine smile, something that would have felt forced just weeks ago. She caught glimpses of Elijah as she moved through the cabin, but he appeared absorbed in his newspaper, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. "Good morning, welcome aboard," she said to each passenger, her voice warm and professional. The cabin filled steadily, and Claire helped an elderly woman store her bag, noticing how Elijah's eyes flickered briefly in her direction. 20 minutes into the flight, Claire was distributing drinks in first class when she heard it, the unmistakable tone of entitled anger that used to set her teeth on edge. "This is completely unacceptable." A man in an expensive suit stood up, his face reddening. "My wife is sitting in economy while there are empty seats up here. Do you know who I am?" Claire took a deep breath, feeling the old familiar surge of irritation. But instead of letting it control her, she set down her drink tray and turned to face him fully. "Sir, I understand your frustration," she said, keeping her voice level and calm. "However, seat upgrades need to be arranged before boarding. It's airline policy." "Policy?" The man scoffed, pulling out his phone. "I have dinner with your board members twice a month. One call, and—" "Sir." Claire interrupted gently but firmly. "I respect your connection to the airline. However, it wouldn't be fair to other passengers if we made exceptions to our policies. Your wife is welcome to purchase an upgrade for future flights through our website or customer service." The man's face grew redder. "This is ridiculous. I want to speak to your supervisor." From the corner of her eye, Claire saw Elijah shift slightly in his seat, but he remained silent, watching the scene unfold. "I am the senior flight attendant on this flight," Claire replied, maintaining her composure. "I understand this isn't the answer you wanted to hear, but I must treat all our passengers equally. Would you like me to have our ground team assist you with an upgrade for your return flight?" The man opened his mouth, then closed it. Claire's calm professionalism had taken the wind out of his sails. After a moment, he sat down, muttering under his breath, but notably deflated. As Claire moved down the aisle with her drink cart, she paused at Elijah's row. "Coffee, sir?" Their eyes met briefly as she handed him his drink. His expression remained neutral, but there was something there. A slight nod, a glimmer of approval in his dark eyes. He didn't need to say anything. Claire knew she had passed this test. The rest of the flight passed without incident. Claire moved through her duties with a newfound sense of peace. When turbulence hit mid-flight, she steadied nervous passengers with genuine concern. When a child spilled juice on his tray table, she cleaned it up with a warm smile and a gentle joke that made him laugh. As they began their descent into Dallas, Claire realized something profound. For the first time in years, she wasn't just going through the motions. She wasn't counting down the minutes until landing. She was actually doing her job, really doing it, and doing it well. The plane touched down smoothly on the Dallas runway. As passengers began to gather their belongings, Claire stood near the exit, thanking each one as they departed. When Elijah passed by, he paused for just a moment. "Thank you for the flight, Ms. Morgan," he said simply, but his eyes held a warmth that spoke volumes. Claire straightened her shoulders, feeling something she hadn't experienced in far too long. Pride. Not the defensive pride that had been her shield for so many years, but genuine satisfaction in a job well done. Claire's heels clicked against the polished floor of Sky High headquarters as she made her way through the maze of corridors. The morning call from Elijah's assistant had caught her off guard, disrupting her usual pre-flight routine. Her Navy uniform felt especially constricting today, and she fought the urge to loosen her scarf. The executive floor was quiet, save for the gentle hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of phones ringing. Glass walls revealed busy executives in their offices, but Claire kept her eyes forward, focused on the double doors at the end of the hall. Elijah's office. His assistant, Maria, looked up from her desk with a warm smile. "Go right in, Ms. Morgan. He's expecting you." Claire's hand hesitated on the door handle. The last time she'd been summoned like this, she'd expected to be fired. Now, weeks later, she still couldn't shake that feeling of uncertainty. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. Elijah's office was exactly as she remembered it, spacious but not ostentatious, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. He sat behind his desk, reviewing documents, but looked up as she entered. His expression was unreadable as always. "Claire," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "Please, sit." She lowered herself into the chair, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. The silence stretched between them as Elijah finished reading whatever document held his attention. Claire resisted the urge to fidget. Finally, he set the papers aside and opened a drawer. Her heart skipped a beat as he pulled out a folder, but instead of the termination papers she half expected, he slid across what looked like a flight itinerary. "Take a look," he said simply. Claire picked up the document, her eyes scanning the details. Her breath caught as she read the destination. Paris, Charles de Gaulle Airport. It was one of Sky High's most prestigious routes, a flight that only the most experienced and trusted crew members were assigned to. "Lead flight attendant position?" Elijah continued, watching her reaction carefully. "If you're ready for it." Claire's fingers tightened on the paper. Lead position on an international flight to Paris wasn't just any assignment. It was a statement. It meant managing a larger crew, handling more complex situations, being responsible for everything from VIP passengers to emergency procedures. It was, in many ways, the ultimate test of a flight attendant's abilities. She started, then stopped, looking up at him. Why are you still giving me chances? Elijah leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. For a moment, he seemed to be looking past her, remembering something from long ago. Because someone once gave me one. The weight of those words hung in the air between them. Claire looked down at the itinerary again, at the opportunity it represented. Just weeks ago, she had been ready to quit, convinced her career was over. Now, here she sat, being offered one of the most coveted positions in the airline. I won't let you down, she said quietly, meeting his gaze. Elijah nodded, the barest hint of a smile touching his lips. I know you won't. The enormity of the moment settled over Claire as she held the Paris itinerary in her hands. This wasn't just another flight assignment. It was a chance at full redemption, an opportunity to prove that she had truly changed. And somehow, despite everything, Elijah Bryant believed she was ready for it. Claire stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her Paris hotel room, watching the city lights twinkle against the darkening sky. The Eiffel Tower stood proud in the distance, its iconic silhouette a reminder of just how far she'd come. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman transformed, still in her sky-high uniform, but standing taller, shoulders no longer weighed down by bitterness. The flight had gone perfectly. Every passenger interaction, every service moment, she'd handled them all with a grace she'd forgotten she possessed. Her crew had worked like a well-oiled machine, and she'd felt that old spark of joy in her work, the one she'd thought was lost forever. She pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over the keyboard. A text seemed too casual, too easy. Deleting the blank message, she walked to the elegant desk by the window and pulled out the hotel's cream-colored stationery. The paper felt expensive under her fingers, fitting for words that carried such weight. Claire picked up the pen, then set it down again. How do you apologize for judging someone so completely wrong? For letting your own pain blind you to another person's humanity? She closed her eyes, remembering that day on the plane, her sharp words, the slap, the look in Elijah's eyes. The memory made her cheeks burn with shame. Taking a deep breath, she began to write, Dear Elijah, I've started this letter a dozen times in my head and none of them seem right. Maybe that's because there's no perfect way to say I'm sorry for being so terribly wrong. That day on the plane, I didn't see you. I didn't see anyone anymore. I saw what I wanted to see, what years of bitterness and struggle had trained me to see. I saw threats instead of people, burdens instead of human beings who deserved dignity and respect. I judged you without knowing your story. I assumed things about you that said more about my own prejudices than anything else. When you showed me where you came from, how hard you worked, how much you overcame, I still fought against seeing it, because accepting that truth meant accepting how wrong I'd been, not just about you, but about so many others. The truth is, I let grief and hardship harden me. After losing Tom, drowning in his medical bills, watching my retirement dreams slip away, I became someone I never wanted to be. I took it out on passengers, on colleagues, on anyone who crossed my path. And then I took it out on you. You could have fired me. You should have fired me. Instead, you showed me something I'd forgotten. Grace. You gave me a chance I didn't deserve, and in doing so, you helped me find my way back to the person I used to be. The person who loved this job, who saw the humanity in every passenger, who understood that kindness matters. I know these words can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I understand now. I see what you were trying to teach me, and I promise you that for whatever time I have left in this career, I will work to be worthy of the second chance you gave me. I will treat every passenger, every colleague, every person I meet with the dignity I failed to show you. Thank you for not giving up on me even when I'd given up on myself. With sincere gratitude, Claire Morgan. She read the letter twice, fighting the urge to crumple it up and start over. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And maybe that's what mattered most. Claire knew Elijah was staying 2 floors above her. All the senior executives were in the premium suites. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the letter and slipped it into an envelope. She wrote his name on the front in careful letters. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. The plush carpet muffled her footsteps as she walked down the quiet hallway to his suite. She stood there for a moment, letter in hand, second-guessing herself. Maybe this was too personal, too emotional. Maybe a simple thank you would have been enough. But she knew it wouldn't be. Some things needed to be said even if they were hard to say, even if they made you vulnerable. Claire knelt down and slowly slid the envelope under his door. It disappeared into the darkness of his room, and she quickly stood up, smoothing her uniform. What's done was done. Back in her room, she changed out of her uniform and tried to distract herself with paperwork for tomorrow's return flight. But her eyes kept drifting to her phone, wondering if she'd made a mistake, if the letter had been too much. Just as she was about to give up and try to sleep, her phone buzzed. 3 simple words appeared on the screen. I already forgave you. Claire felt tears prick at her eyes as she read the message again. No lengthy response, no grand gesture. Just quiet grace, exactly what he'd shown her all along. She walked back to the window, looking out at the Paris lights. For the first time in years, she felt truly light, as if a weight she'd carried for so long had finally lifted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new passengers, new opportunities to prove she'd changed. But tonight, in this moment, she could finally forgive herself too. Claire wheeled her carry-on through JFK's bustling terminal, her body tired but her spirit light after the successful Paris flight. The morning sun streamed through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Her navy blue uniform still looked crisp despite the long-haul flight, and she walked with a confidence that felt both familiar and new. As she made her way toward the crew area, she noticed subtle changes in how people looked at her. Fellow flight attendants whispered and smiled. A gate agent she barely knew gave her a thumbs up. Even the security guard at the crew entrance seemed more cheerful than usual. Something's definitely going on, Claire muttered to herself, quickening her pace. When she reached the break room, the door burst open before she could even touch the handle. Janet practically bounced out, her face lit up with excitement. Her friend's enthusiasm was contagious, though Claire had no idea what caused it. Claire, thank goodness you're here. Janet grabbed her arm, practically dragging her inside. Have you seen the employee bulletin? They just announced the Service Excellence Award winners. Claire blinked, trying to process Janet's words through her jet lag. The what now? The annual awards. You know, the ones they give out to only the top performers? Janet guided her toward the bulletin board, which was surrounded by a small crowd of crew members. They parted as Claire approached, some offering congratulatory smiles. Claire's eyes scanned the colorful announcement posted prominently in the center of the board. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw her name, printed in bold letters, Claire Morgan, Outstanding Service and Professional Growth. The room seemed to spin slightly. She reached out, steadying herself against the wall. This has to be a mistake. Not a mistake, Janet said softly, squeezing her shoulder. You earned this, Claire. Every bit of it. Claire read the citation below her name. For demonstrating exceptional professional development and dedication to passenger service excellence. Through personal growth and commitment to improvement, Ms. Morgan has become an inspiration to her fellow crew members and a model of Sky High's values. Her vision blurred slightly as she noticed the signature at the bottom, Elijah Bryant's bold, confident strokes. He had personally approved this recognition. I can't believe it, she whispered, touching the paper as if to verify it was real. Why not? Janet asked, leaning against the wall beside her. Look how far you've come. A few months ago, you would have laughed at the idea of winning something like this. Claire swallowed hard because Janet was right. The old Claire would have scoffed at these awards, dismissed them as corporate propaganda. She would have bitter comments about favoritism and politics. But now... You know what's really special about this? Janet continued, her voice gentle. Everyone here knows your story. They saw you at your lowest, and they've watched you climb back up. That makes this mean even more. Other crew members began approaching, offering congratulations. Young flight attendants she had trained, senior crew members who had once avoided her sharp tongue. They all seemed genuinely happy for her. Some shared stories of how she had helped them recently, moments of kindness she hadn't even thought twice about at the time. Claire stood there, overwhelmed by the warmth and recognition surrounding her. Her throat felt tight as she realized something profound. She no longer felt like she was fighting to prove herself. The constant defensive tension she'd carried for so long had melted away. She belonged here now, not because anyone had given her permission, but because she had earned it through genuine change. She looked around the break room, seeing it with new eyes. The worn couches where she had once sat alone, nursing her bitterness. The coffee machine where she used to rush through breaks, avoiding conversation. The bulletin board where she had ignored announcements just like this one, convinced they didn't matter. Now it all felt different. This wasn't just a workplace anymore, it was a community she had finally allowed herself to join. "I need to sit down," Claire said, her legs feeling slightly wobbly. Janet guided her to a nearby chair, still beaming. "So," Janet said, pulling up another chair beside her, "when are you going to call Maggie and tell her? She's going to be so proud." Claire touched the sky-high wings pinned to her uniform, remembering how close she had come to losing them. "You know what? I think I'll tell her in person. Maybe over dinner tonight." More crew members filtered into the break room, some just arriving for their shifts, others finishing up. Each one who saw the announcement seemed genuinely pleased, stopping to offer congratulations or a kind word. Claire accepted each one with grace, no longer feeling the need to deflect or diminish the recognition. She caught her reflection in the break room window, the same uniform, the same face, but somehow everything was different. The bitter mask she had worn for so long had softened into something more genuine. Her eyes looked brighter, more alive. A young flight attendant she had recently trained approached hesitantly. "Ms. Morgan, I just wanted to say, you've really shown us that it's possible to change, to get better. Thank you for that." Claire felt tears threatening to form, but managed to keep her composure. She reached out and squeezed the young woman's hand. "Thank you. Just remember to be kinder to yourself than I was. Don't wait as long as I did to let the light in." The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, warming the break room. Claire sat quietly, surrounded by the gentle buzz of conversation and laughter, finally feeling at peace in a place she had once treated as a battlefield. Claire stood before a room of fresh recruits at Sky High, their eager and uncertain faces mirroring her own from years past. No longer defined by bitterness, she shared her story, how she once let frustration cloud her judgment, nearly losing everything. She spoke of her turning point, an incident with an elderly passenger, later revealed as the airline's CEO, Elijah Bryant. Instead of being fired, she was given a chance to rediscover her purpose. "Every interaction matters," she told them. "This job isn't just about procedures, it's about people." The trainees leaned in, captivated. Claire wasn't just training them, she was preparing them to see the humanity in every passenger. As hands shot up with questions, Claire realized she had truly found her place. Claire hesitated before stepping into the cafe where Elijah waited. Their last real conversation had been in Paris, where she'd written him an apology letter she was never sure he read. "You look different," Elijah observed over coffee. "I feel different," Claire admitted. Elijah acknowledged that her journey had also been a lesson for him, reminding him that leadership wasn't just about policies, but understanding people. "Thank you for not giving up on me," Claire said sincerely. "I knew you wouldn't let me," Elijah replied with a small smile. For the first time, their relationship wasn't adversarial. It was one of mutual respect. As Claire left the cafe, she felt the weight of her past finally lift. Packing for a long overdue visit to her daughter and grandsons, Claire smiled at their crayon-colored welcome sign. For years, work had been an excuse to avoid slowing down. Now, with a stable position and regular hours, she could finally put family first. A knock at the door brought a sleek black package from Sky High. Inside, a letter from Elijah praised her transformation, and beneath it lay a gleaming new name tag, Senior Training Specialist, Claire Morgan. Holding it in her hands, Claire realized this wasn't just a promotion. It was a testament to everything she had overcome. On a flight to visit her family, Claire relaxed for the first time as a passenger. The voice over the intercom was familiar. Sophia, the young flight attendant she had once mentored. When Sophia reached her row, she paused, eyes lighting up. "Ms. Morgan, or should I say Claire?" Claire smiled. "Just Claire now." Sophia handed her a coffee, black, just how she liked it, and a pack of cookies. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You made a difference." As the plane soared above the clouds, Claire felt it. Peace. She had let go of the past, found her purpose, and now she was exactly where she was meant to be. If you enjoyed the story of Elijah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.